Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's live webinar. This is the final webinar in our three-part series, Customer Experience Architecture, Designing for the Customer. We are so glad that you could join us today. First, I'd like to start with an overview of today's agenda. We have about 5 minutes of introductions, which I'm going through now, followed by 35 to 40 minutes for our presenters, which is the main content of the show. And to wrap us up, we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes of live Q&A from you, the audience. So to submit your questions for that, please use the Q&A module at the bottom left of the browser, and keep in mind, you can do that at any time during the presentation. You don't have to wait until the end. Also, make note of the widgets at the bottom of your browser. They have additional resources, including any tech support you may need. So real quickly, to give you a brief background on CMSWire, we were founded in 2003. We have 400 plus editorial contributors, along with key services where we create more than 140 original articles each month. Most of those are on digital customer experience, the digital workplace, and information management. On top of that, we also host things like monthly editorial themes, tweet jams, hangouts, and webinars like this one. Today's webinar is sponsored by dotCMS. dotCMS is an enterprise-level content hub which allows global organizations to deliver scale and manage memorable, lasting customer experiences. And you can learn more about dotCMS by visiting www.dotCMS.com. And there I am, your moderator. I'm Rich Hine. I'm head of content and audience strategy at CMSWire. And your two presenters today are Gerry McGovern, founder and CEO of Customer Carewords, along with J. Robert Slaughter, marketing strategist at dotCMS. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Robert. Robert, please go ahead and take it away.
Hey, thank you, Rich. You know, we're very thankful to have sponsored and participated in this great webinar series with Gerry and with the folks at CMSWire. You know, this all kicked off nearly 2 months ago when we discussed identifying what really matters to your customers. Then we followed that month with measuring performance. And today, Gerry is going to bring it all home and detail how you use all of this CX data to design clear and easy to use customer-centric navigation. But before I hand it over to Gerry, I'd like to ask a rhetorical question. Why is any of this important to my or your organization? And of course, you know, the great Peter Drucker nailed it. Because the purpose of business is to create a customer. That's it. And getting mind share with today's buyer is so much more difficult than it's ever been. The white noise, the competitors, the consumer expectations are just making this job so much harder. So I like to say it takes two to tango and to create today's customer. This series is focused on the data and making CX decisions, and I wholeheartedly back that 100%. However, data-driven data does not deliver an experience. The left brain data and the brain content need to work together in order to engage and delight today's consumer. So our point of view here at dotCMS is that data-driven content must be across any and all ready with the right buyer at the right time. So really it boils down to data and content are the foundation of today's customer experiences. So with that, I am now going to turn it over to Gerry McGovern for today's presentation, CX Architecture, Designing for the Customer. Take it away, Gerry.
Thanks very much, Rob. Welcome, everyone. So as Rob gave the introduction there, this is a kind of the culmination of what you can do when you've really understood what's really important, what's most important to your customers. And this is particularly going to focus on a case study around the European Commission, the European Union, of creating a unified information architecture and structure for all the information within the universe of the European Commission. How did we get to this sort of structure that was both intuitive, so we could statistically prove that this makes it easier for people to find what they need, but it was also politically acceptable. It was signed off at the very most senior level within the European Commission. So combining both the organizational priorities and sense of what is important with the customers, the citizens, the business of Europe, how did we marry those two set of needs into a single structure that both entities, the organization itself and the customer, the citizen and the business could accept and say, yeah, we buy into that. This actually works. So I'm going to bring you through how to design this sort of thing for generally a complicated environment. This method is more for larger, more complex type of environments where there can be a lot of politics and needs from various different elements within the organization, and of course coming from that outside place of the need of the customer out there. So essentially it begins with identifying your top tasks of your customers. I went through that in the first webinar almost 2 months ago now. If you haven't followed that, you need a league table. You need somewhere that says, these are what are most important, these are what are least important. So you need some sort of clear data that articulates in a hierarchical way what is most important and what is least important to the customer. So the top task identification methodology is one of the ways of doing that. There are other sort of methods, but you need that clarity to move forward with this particular method. So let's say we've got our top tasks. We're going to show you a process of sorting those, in essence, where the customer sorts and organizes them. So we go out to the customer and we say, please group these. How would you organize? How would you group these? Out of that will come a set of hypothetical classifications. So we've got a hypothesis of this is the structure that might work. But you can't stop there because there are inherent flaws in sorting and initial classification. You will rarely, if ever, get a very good information architecture purely by just doing a sort and developing classes from that sort. You really need to test the hypothesis. And how do you test it? You test it with instructions that are reflective of the top task. So if it's downloading software in Cisco, you ask things like, oh, where would you click on this classification to download the latest firmware for the RV/over2 router? So you test the classification with specific instructions, and I'm going to explain those. And typically you need 3 rounds of testing. It's rare you'll get, your target is in essence to get to 80 to 90% success rate, which means that for 80 to 90% of the instructions, they click on the most appropriate class to solve that problem. It matches with the hypothesis. Typically, it's almost impossible to achieve that in the first round. Typically, you'll get to about 60% success rate. Then you'll learn stuff, oh, this is working, this isn't working. You'll make some changes and you need to go out again into round 2 and usually into round 3 to get to that 80 to 90% success rate. So I'm going to bring you through in a step-by-step process how we actually do this, how we actually go through this process. As I said, it starts with the top tasks. So there's a list here, I know you can't read it, but of 77 tasks. So typically in any complicated environment, whether it's for Toyota or IKEA or Rolls-Royce or BBC or Cisco or an IBM or a Microsoft or even a Google environment, there's typically no more than 100 crucial tasks that really matter to people. So there's no more than this set of somewhere in the region of 50 to 100. Now, most environments that we work with today, it's somewhere between 50 and 80. In the European Union, European Commission, which is a very complex environment, 27, 28 countries dealing with hundreds of 400 million plus people, we ended up with about 80 things that really mattered. So we went out and we got people to vote. We actually got over 100,000 people. It was an extraordinary vote. Typically you only need about 400 for this to be successful. We got over 100,000. So it gave us a league table of what matters and what doesn't matter in the process. And the yellow, as you see at the top, a small set got as much, that's the first 25% of the vote. See that white there, that's the final 25% of the vote. So we get a small set of tasks, have a disproportionate share of the vote. Now, if you want to create an architecture that works, that really, really works for your customer, you orient that architecture around the top tasks. So you don't start the initial sort by asking people to sort everything. You ask them to sort the top of the environment. Now, you're going to create an architecture that's going to work for everything. It's just that you're going to orient it, you're going to focus it, and make it easier to find the most important stuff. So you're creating a structure where the top tasks are easiest to find, and where the other tasks are, they're there, but they're probably at level 2 or level 3 of the structure. So this is a key point. You've got your top task data, you've got your top to the bottom. When you're creating your architecture, you begin the process from the point of view of the most important stuff. So out of about 80 tasks, we only chose 30 for sorting, to go back out to the customers again and say, how would you group, how would you organize these things? And you can see most of these were taken from the top tasks, but a few of them at the bottom, you see they're white. Well, these were seen as political priorities. So sometimes we'll add a couple of tasks that might have been lower down the list, but are seen as very strategically important. But the vast majority of the tasks on this list are very much the yellows and the greens and the high scoring turquoise, which is 50 to 75% of the vote, but dominated by the most important stuff. So there's a key step where you take your top tasks, your overall list, 50 to 80, maybe up to 100 in exceptions, and you select about 30 of those that you're going to go back out to the customer and you're going to ask them, how would you organize these? How would you group these? So in the left column, and we use Optimal Workshop, there are other tools to do this, you put the tasks and they're here, and you get people to group them, to sort and to group them. So they drag them over into the center column and they start creating groups with them. So that's the first process. You've given them a bunch of tasks and you've said, how would you now group these? Because this is the foundations or the initial step in creating an information architecture, a classification system that is actually intuitive. So we're designing with the customer, not for the customer. This is the new mode of design. This is what these new tools allow us to do, to design with the customer, not simply for the customer. How many people do you need to do this? You only need 15 to begin to get statistically reliable data. Now, we had hundreds and hundreds when we did the European Union. Remember, we had 100,000 who actually voted on the top task. But then in these sorting processes, we had maybe 300 or 400. You don't need that number. We have done many of these studies and we found that at about 15 people, the patterns begin to emerge. Ideally, if you could get 30 people, that would be even better in the 30 plus. But 15 is enough in most cases for the actual sorting patterns begin to emerge. And what is a sorting pattern? Well, it's something like here, and this is what's called a similarity matrix. It says, well, 87% of the time, people group climate change, global warming and environmental protection together. That makes sense when you think about it. But this is giving us real data about how real people think and how they want to see stuff organized in the process. And here we see 80% of the time find a job in another EU country and working in an EU country has been grouped together. So we're getting this like PET scan of the customer's brain. How are they thinking? What really matters to them? How do they like to see stuff organized? Because I guarantee you, if you give back to people the structure that's inside their brain, that's going to be much more intuitive, that's going to be much more easier to use than if you design it internally from your team's perspective. So we get this sort of interesting data. And then this is what's called a dendrogram. Here we have what's called an orphan task. And an orphan task is a task that's not really grouped strongly with anything else. So we see this over here, climate change and environmental protection, they're strongly grouped together. But then we've got this orphan. So what happens with orphans? Well, it depends on the type of orphan it is. If it's a top task orphan, so if it's in the yellow and green, the first 50% of the vote, so it's very high importance, then that orphan has a very strong case for being in the top level of the information architecture. Because we know that if it's not at the top level, it's going to be problematic to find because nobody's really grouping it with anything else. So if we put it under other groups, it's going to be more problematic and difficult for it to find. So we can see here that statistics and forecasts was 14th in the overall list of 80 tasks. So it was in the green world, the 25 to 50% of the vote. So therefore, it had a good case to be at the top level of the actual structure. So this is the final structure, and we see statistics is in that top level. So everything that happened here had evidence. Nothing that happened in this process was says, oh, let's put education here, let's call it this. Everything was done based on data and based on evidence. And that's why it was acceptable to the management and to the other entities within the European Commission, because there was evidence to back it up rather than opinion. We had statistically reliable evidence to prove each step of the way what we had actually done. So this here is for an Irish health environment for what's called HSE, Health and Social Services, or the Irish Department of Health. So once you've got your patterns, your orphans and your groups, etc., you come up with a hypothetical classification. And then you classify everything in your list. So in the Irish health environment, there was 74. Remember, there was 77 in the European Union. 70. This was in dealing with health. You know, what's most important to you. So we went through a process where we got our orphans or our groups here, and then we went through everything and grouped everything that was in the initial list of top tasks. And we can see here there's a couple remaining that we hadn't finally grouped, but this is moving down to the actual bottom of the list. So everything gets grouped. And of course, everything has a percentage vote because people voted on these things to understand their importance to the customers. And we'll see how important and how useful that is in a moment. Because jumping back now to the European Commission, we see the law, what was classed under law in the initial hypothesis, overall accounted for 13% of the customer vote. So out of the 100% of importance that customers felt in doing stuff with the European Commission, 13% of that stuff, those tasks, were law-related type of things. So when we do that, we have our initial hypothesis because we looked at our similarity matrix and our dendrograms and orphans, etc., and we come up with what we think are the groups. Now, why did we do that? Why didn't we ask the customers to do that? What we found over years and years of doing this is that customers are great at grouping stuff, but they are terrible at giving groups names. You know, so they're great at saying, oh, this goes with this goes with this, but they're really, really bad. They really, really struggle to actually name those groups. And that's one little trick that you should use, is that never make it mandatory in the sorting process for people to have to name the groups, because otherwise, if you do that, loads and loads of people will abandon. So it's our job to come up with the hypothesis and say, what are the patterns telling us? And then, of course, we went through the 77 tasks and we classified everyone either as business, work, live, travel. And now we've got a basic map of importance. And we see, oh, there's 4 major groups: business, work, live, travel, law, about the EU, and then here's the other percentages. So what is the implications of this? Well, we see, remember law, I showed law area, that was 13%. Now, so it's the number 3 group class, and business is 15%. So what's the implication there? In the ultimate classification, business is the first class. So oftentimes it's not a good idea to have an A to a Z. Somebody once said A to a Z is another form of random. This is prioritized based on the most important groups. So we see all the live, work, travel, law about the European Union. So we're orienting that structure to make it easiest and fastest to find the most important stuff first. So this is very much a focus on let's make it easy to find the most important stuff first. And when you have this sort of data, these percentages, etc., you can make those decisions and stand over those decisions in the process. So now we've got our hypothesis. So I'm jumping back to this health environment again. Now we got to test the hypothesis. It's still just a hypothesis. How do we test it? With a bunch of task instructions. We say, find information about community support for a carer of someone who has dementia. And then we say, where would you click? And we monitor where do people click, and we say, oh, we expect them to click on services, and but only 40% clicked on services. So we've got a hypothetical structure. We've got a bunch of questions that we can test against that structure with a similar group of people, not the same type of people ideally, but a similar profile of people to see how are we performing. So essentially, everything you put into the sort, you remember I said that about 30 of those things should have an instruction. So we have here waiting times was the top task in the health. So find waiting times for child and adolescent mental health services. And the hypothetical classification that we expected that under should be find services. So you need between 15 and 35 of these, because you need to robustly test the architecture. If you only test it with 5 or 6 instructions, you're not really putting it through its paces. You need to test it with a wide range of task instructions based on the top tasks and those that went into the sort to see, is it really working for everything in the process? And I'll explain the importance of having a significant, at least a minimum of 15, and ideally we've up to around 30 or 35 task instructions that we actually use. So here, this was top task number 3 in the European Commission, funding grants and subsidies. A researcher wants to start a new project, find out if there's an EU grant available. So we expected that they would click on funding. That was the hypothesis. Now we go out, we find another group of people, we give them these 30 or so task instruction. We say, where would you click? Where would you select to solve this sort of problem? And then we get data back. And it shows that this particular task only had a 48% success rate after the first round. Why was that? Well, 48% clicked on funding and another 48% clicked on research and innovation. This is what we call a twin. And this is an extremely common behavior pattern that occurs again and again. It's the object or the subject in the process. Some people think, oh, this is a funding task. Some people think, no, it's a research and innovation task. If you're looking for the price for a Prius, some people might look for price first, some people might look for Prius first. There's these constant twin ways of thinking. So then we had to chat with the European Commission and say, listen, if we only put it under the funding area, we're going to have a lot of wasted time or people lost or people giving up in the process. For funding for research and innovation, we need to have a link under research and innovation as well to the funding environment. So this tells you where you need cross links, etc., etc. So if we look here, we see task funding grant subsidies the researcher wants. So the previous round that I showed you that we had a failure, and then they agreed and they says, oh yeah, we need to twin that one. We're learning from the customer. So we go up from a 48% success rate to a 92% success rate. Typically, we're trying to get over 80% as a baseline. In this sort of measurement environments, if you get it over 80, that's a substantial success. It is almost impossible to get to 100%. Particularly an average of 100% over 30 tasks in the process. So here's another task. This had a find a job in another EU country. This had a 53% success rate. So a lot of failure. You know, what was causing it? Well, basically, we expected people to click on work, live and travel. Now, there was this classification called jobs, but jobs was for jobs at the European Commission. It was what we call a dirty magnet. It was too vague, it was too big, it was too all-embracing in the process. So we brought the data back and we says, oh, look, it's not working. It's find a job in another EU country. You don't want them to click on this jobs because these are only jobs that are provided by the European Commission. What are we going to do about this? So for the next round, it was changed to jobs at the European Commission. Now, it didn't totally solve it, but it dropped from a 44% failure rate to a 17% failure rate. Still work to be done. We're heading in the right direction. We've gone from 54%. We're now almost at 80% in the success rate. So sometimes classification terms, they're too vague, they're too high level, and they become what we call dirty magnets. They attract clicks for the wrong reasons in the process. So this one here, big failure rate, find out what projects the EU is supporting in a particular city. The problem here was the class itself. It was a kind of a mismatcher. We put a lot of stuff into one class and we thought it might work, but it didn't. You know, food and farming and regional development in the process. So it really wasn't working for a lot of the tasks it was supposed to work at. We also saw it was a twin as well in the process. So we learned that it was a twin, but we learned that this class wasn't working. So in the next round, we broke it up. We broke it up to food and farming and EU regional and urban development. And the success rate improved very substantially from 27% up to 84% in the process. So sometimes you'll find this class just isn't working. You know, do we delete it? Do we break it up? What do we do with it in the process? So you're learning from the behavior of the customer in the process. So here, this was a Toyota project that we did in Norway. And obviously it's in Norwegian, but I translated the task. Does air conditioning normally come with a Prius? So in one of the rounds, 53% of people were clicking on Place og Coupe, which means essentially the rough translation space and room from an English point of view. But coupe, as we analysed, had a bigger concept in people's mind. That just word, coupe, had a bigger concept in Norwegian than initially Toyota Norway thought it actually would have. And when we, in the next round, we just changed it to Place, that failure rate went from 53% to 0. So does air conditioning? No, they were supposed to click on dashboard or on accessories, tilbehør. So the failure, look at that drop. Just a couple of words of change from Place to Place og Coupe. Instead of being a failure of 53%, it drops to 0. And the same pattern emerged for another task. What are the noise reduction features in an hours? It was causing a 67% failure rate in one round. We changed it from Place og Coupe to Place. Bang! We lose the entire failure rate. It stops being a dirty magnet. It stops negatively impacting the actual journey in the process. So sometimes one word can have a major impact on customer behavior, whether they'll click or not click in the process. And this is why we need multiple rounds to go through so that we can develop hypotheses, test them, prove them or not prove them in the actual process. So I'd like to finish with basically looking at a concept, what we call the Magnetism Score. And the Magnetism Score is basically the success rate, the average success rate. So the tasks that it's supposed to work for the particular class. How well is it working for those? And then those tasks that it's not working, that it's not supposed to work for. So that in that round, the Place au Coupé would have a big negative score for a lot of tasks because it's behaving as what we call a dirty magnet. It's not got clean magnetism, it's got dirty magnetism, and it's pulling people in the wrong direction, sending them in the wrong direction, wasting their time in the process. So the overall magnetism score is a measure of the power of a class to bring people to it where it should bring people to it, and to not bring people to it for tasks that it shouldn't. You simply should not measure the actual positive clicks. You also need to measure the negative clicks in the environment. You might have a section on your website that you think is really popular, and it's really popular because it's getting a lot of clicks, but it might be getting a lot of those clicks for all the wrong reasons. So it's not enough to measure the amount of visits to a particular section or area in your website. It may be that a significant percentage of those visits are being caused by a problem either in your search structure or in your navigation and classification structure. So the magnetism score is essentially the average success rate minus the average failure rate from testing these task instructions. So let's have a look at that from the point of view of a particular class, this time from Irish Health. So let's look at screening and vaccinations. So basically, here's the task instructions or the task areas that this should have worked well for. So this is what it was expected to work well for. So find out if a child should get the MMR vaccine, yeah, 88% of the time clicking. Screening, find out how to get a smear test, 58% of the time. Now, these are quite good. These are really good scores because remember, there's twins in a lot of these situations. So it's totally rare that for one instruction, one class will have 100% of the clicks. So the overall clean magnet score is 57% in this specific environment. So that's quite a decent score. That's quite a strong score. So that's the positive in the environment. Here is the dirty magnet, so to speak, in the process. So we see the biggest one here is appointments. How does someone make an appointment for their first scan during pregnancy? Now, you could debate that and say, hey, that should also be correct under screening because customers are thinking of a scan as also screening. Maybe there's a debate there, but let's say for the moment we're not going to leave it correct. These are the other, how do sexually transmitted infections affect fertility. So 8% for that particular task instruction, we're clicking on the screening and vaccination, behaving as a dirty magnet. And across the average dirty magnet across these tasks is actually 6% in the actual process. So we've got 6% negative, on average, negative dirty magnetism in the process. So therefore, we've got 57% minus 6%. So the magnetism of that specific class is 51%. And that is generally quite a positive score. Sometimes you get magnetism, down under. Sometimes you get negative magnetism because the negative power of the task is greater than the positive power. So 51% is generally quite good. Obviously, it needs to be compared with the other classes in the environment. That's how you understand its power in this section. But generally speaking, a 51% magnetism score is a pretty decent score. So this sort of methodology, this sort of approach, you start off with your sort, you get your top task, you take a selection of 30 or so of those tasks in the process. You come up with your hypothetical classification, you come up with your task instructions, you go out to another bunch of people in round one where you ask them, where would you click for this specific instruction? Typically, after round one, you hit in the region of a 63% success rate. Then you move into round two, you make your changes. Oh, are there twins? Will we change this to jobs at the European Commission? Will we get rid of Place au Coupé and just have Place in the process? You learn what's working, what's not working. You go to round two. It's getting better, but there's still going to be a couple of things outstanding. Typically, as we said, we find it really needs 3 rounds of of testing and learning and refining to get up towards that magic 90% in the process. So this is all about evidence, really taking, designing with the customer, using their behavior, understanding what they're doing, how they group things, how they react to specific environments and task instructions. And by doing that, you get a much more intuitive structure. With a much more intuitive structure, you get a much better customer experience, and you help people do what they need to do in an intuitive, easy, fast way within your environment. So thank you for listening. That's the presentation. There's lots of time for questions that we have, and I'll hand it back to Rich for questions. Please feel free now to ask your questions, and let's see if we can get a discussion and we can answer them.
Thank you, Gerry. And thank you, Robert, as well, both for your presentations. We've now reached the live Q&A portion of the webinar, and we definitely want to hear from you. So please, if you haven't already, use the Q&A module at the bottom left of the browser and submit your questions. It's also great to let the community know what you're up to. So if you've heard something interesting, please tweet about it using the provided Twitter handles. And also be sure to check out the speaker widget to the left to learn more about today's presenters, and the resources widget to the right for more information. All right, so the first question I'm looking at here is from Eduardo. This is for Gerry. Are there any fundamental differences between an information architecture for desktop and mobile? In other words, is there room for two different information architectures depending on the device? Can the top task differ depending if you're on a desktop and a mobile device?
Yeah, it's generally the simple answer, Eduardo, is no. That's the simple answer. If at all possible, create the same structure, create the same information architecture that will work independent of device. Now, as we get more complicated, as we get, more sophisticated. So if you're, say, in a health environment in 5 or 10 years, and then it understands your location. So it understands that you're now approaching the hospital. Then when you load the website or whatever we will call it in 10 years time or 5 years time, or you may see tasks about parking. You may see tasks about finding the place within the hospital that you actually need to go to. You may see location specific tasks as you get closer to your actual destination. So I think over time, we will become more sophisticated to understand the context or the place that the person is actually in. But generally speaking, one architecture, one structure is, people get incredibly frustrated when they go to a mobile environment and it only has a small selection of the stuff that's there. They may want to dig very deep into understanding that condition on their mobile, on the train on the way home. This idea that we make decisions and say, oh no, the detailed condition information, we will not make that available on the mobile website. That drives people wild, really angry. It angers people because it takes control away from them. So the general rule is a single architecture, but I would design from a mobile concept. I design from mobile thinking, which is fast and easy, design mobile upwards, but a single overall information architecture is 9 times or 99 times out of 100 by far the best option.
Thanks, Gerry. And a quick question that I have is, do you need to use the same group of people for every test?
Yeah, well, the same profile, Rich, broadly, like if you've got 8 doctors and 8 patients in round 1, you should have 10 doctors and 10 patients in round 2. You know, that rough sort of profile, but ideally not the exact same doctors or the exact same patients so the same profile of people, but not the same, exactly the same people. I mean, it's not the end of the world if you used exactly, but you know, there's going to be a bit of learning that those people will have. So the same profile of people, but not the same, not exactly the same people if you can avoid it.
Okay, thank you. And Nay actually has a follow-up question to that. And her question, or I'm sorry, Nay's question is it wiser to ask existing customer users to group tasks, or can it be helpful to ask input of people that have no prior knowledge to the subject?
Well, I think you need, you know, it depends on the environment. Generally, you need interested parties. So if they're not current customers, then potential customers, and then you can divide the data up. You could, you know, entities like Optimal Workshop will allow you just to sort the data based on potential customers and on current customers. We have generally found that there isn't huge differences out there. So we did this for buying a car now across, you know, for Toyota in many environments. We didn't find huge differences. Humans tend to sort very similarly in the health area, whether they were doctors or patients, or they tended to sort and organize and group things in the same way. But, you know, you wouldn't want to ask people who have no understanding of a network infrastructure to group network infrastructure type tasks for Cisco. So they'd have to be network engineers. So you'd need people who are at least have an understanding of what the environment is about. In health, you know, everybody has to deal with our health. So the entire population is you know, potentially useful in that environment. But in other environments, once the people they're relevant, they understand the environment, I wouldn't worry too much about getting really precise profiles. Because the other thing is that you're working with a small sample set, 15 to 30 people, and if you get too rigid about getting profiles, you're not going to get those within 30 or so people. You're going to have to go out for much higher numbers in the process. So basically, you know, getting people within the universe of the task environment that actually understand it and are actually interested in it. The interest, I think, is the key thing, that the interest in the engagement. If you give this out to, you know, a hired panel that couldn't care less, you're going to get inferior stuff. But if you give it out to people that actually care and are interested in the subject, you're going to get much, much better results.
Okay, great. So this next question is from Sean, and Sean would like to know if you could speak a little bit about how you come up with your initial class categories and your thought process there. In Sean's experience, he sees a lot of sites during this exercise that stuff too much under ambiguous, unclear categories like services or resources.
Yeah, and these are absolutely you know, these are the no-nos in the process. Well, what will happen as well, and I'm just going to go back a bit to show some examples, in that basically, if you have those very vague, high-level terms, which are terrible as classifications, as a general, certainly things like resources and tools and knowledge base, etc. in the process, then you'll have a very big failure rate coming through. So generally speaking, we try and pull the class name from, as much as possible, the actual task itself. So here, you know, this is the task of mental well-being, stress reduction, etc. And we call the class mental and physical well-being. So the task are costs and fees, costs and entitlements. So screening and vaccinations here, because we saw vaccinations and screening being grouped together, you know, conditions and diseases, check symptoms. The more unique you can make the classification, the more likely that classification is to be successful. So the more vague and all-embracing, like resources, as you said, terrible names. These are the classic dirty magnets. So the more you name your classes based on the tasks themselves. So in a municipality or a city, libraries, schools, roads, the things connected with the, what people are doing in the actual environment. So the more specific you make them, however, if you don't make them, if they are bad, then in round one, you'll only have a 40% success rate, and you'll have loads of dirty magnets and you'll have loads of problems. That's why we need 3 rounds to really, because you're starting with a hypothesis. The people who just move straight from sort into an information architecture, oh, well, you're not going to get a good result out of that. I've never seen, and even when you do it well, and we've been doing it for years, and years and years and years, and hopefully I've learned lots of lessons. Even when we're doing it, we're lucky if we get a 60 to 65% success rate in round one, even with all the experience. So absolutely go for much more specific tasks are a much better way to name an architecture than vague things like solutions and resources, etc. They drive people mad. They don't know where to click to solve their actual problems.
Great. Thanks, Gerry. So the next question is from Yvonne. And she would like to know, is there a maximum or minimum number of classes that you would suggest creating before getting groupings?
Yeah, that's a good point. The classes, the number of classes is dependent on the uniqueness of the classes. But there's obviously a limit. But we have found that, this old rule, 5 to 7, but that was actually for a very different concept. That was for what you can keep in your short-term memory. It wasn't what you can scan. Obviously, the less, the better. So we would definitely try and keep most environments under 10. Between 5 and 7 is a happy area. Now, the European Commission, extremely complicated, 400 million people, 27, 28 countries, 24 languages, extraordinarily complicated. We ended up there around 15 or 16. Certainly, we rarely if ever have gone beyond 15 in an environment in 20 years of doing that. So the happy spot about 5 to 7. Somewhere in that, or that territory that we find a lot of environments coming in under, or maybe even under 5, but certainly not over 7. But a lot of environments we find somewhere in the region of 5 to 7. Definitely try and keep it under 10. But if you're in a huge environment like gov.uk or digital gov, or you may be going up to the 15 territory, but maybe you can go beyond that for a Walmart or or an Amazon. It really, if they're really unique, people can scan them, and they're really distinctive. They can scan quite a bit, but certainly I'd keep a maximum limit in around the 15, if at all possible.
Okay, thanks, Yvonne. This next question is from Alan. And he'd like to know, how much effort do you put into site search as a method of increasing task completion rates?
Well, site search is a kind of another, it's the other part of the equation. If you've got a great information architecture, you're going to have a great site search. The better you've structured your content, the easier it'll be to find. The more intuitive the words you've used, the more words you've used based on how customers think and how they behave, the more Google likes you, the more Bing likes you, or whoever in the process. So the better your structure, the better your search will be. Search thrives in a well-structured environment. Search struggles in a poor structured environment. And people say, oh yeah, but why don't we just use Google? Well, do you think that the website that's first in Google got there by accident? Do you think that they haven't made a massive effort in their information architecture and their metadata, etc., to actually get first or second in Google? All the sites that get found in Google and have made massive investments in their information architectures and their metadata. In essence, information architecture is another form of metadata in the process. So the better the information architecture, the better the search results that will actually be. And what you will find as well is that for some tasks, people prefer to click. We watch network engineers all the time. If they're downloading software updates, they don't want to go to the search and search for updates when there's a link that says downloads, and they can go through a simplified, clear process to choose the exact type of firmware that they actually need to download for this specific router. So there are a great many tasks that truly benefit from clear, simplified information architectural paths in the process, that people would much prefer to click and go on those paths than go to the search. But as I said, they combine. And then some tasks, like advanced troubleshooting, people will immediately go for search as their first step in the process. But then they'll land on a page, maybe 2 or 3 levels down, and then they'll still have to click 2 or 3 times to solve their problems. So often what search does is it jumps you a couple of steps down the information architecture, but then you need to get the next steps in the process. So search is definitely not a solution for information architecture. Just focusing on search will not solve your problem. You need both. You need a great information architecture and a great search strategy and process.
All right. This next question is from Michael. How is the inclusion matrix data sourced to show the grouped tasks? Is it using the first task survey or sort?
That's using the sort. So the first task survey, out of that we get what we're going to sort. So the first task survey had about 80 tasks in it. Then we said, well, we take the 30 most important of those and we put them into the sort. So then we get a minimum of 15 people to do that sort, and then you get the similarity matrix coming out of that in the process. So that similarity matrix is saying such a things that, oh, well, 80%, 87% of people always grouped climate change with environment in the process. So the similarity matrix is an output of the sort process.
All right, thanks. This next question looks like it's from Michael in Glasgow. He says, hi, Gerry. Where have you experienced the biggest pushback on the methodology? And how did you ultimately achieve buy-in?
Well, it's good. Sometimes you don't, Michael. Sometimes when we get these pet ideas from senior managers or marketers, oh, we have to have solutions, or we have to have, and sometimes you'll have scenarios where, no, we don't want a structure like that. We've got a big, content management system or document management system, and everything. We just want to call that knowledge base, because otherwise we'd have to break it up and create troubleshooting, etc. So sometimes there's a pushback that says, hey, this is hard work. Why can't we just keep up with our lovely silos and all our data dumps, etc., and just let the customer figure out how we're organized in the process. So when you've got a very ego-driven or maybe overly traditionally IT-focused environment, you get a kind of a culture that really doesn't think that making it easier for the customer matters in the process, or they feel that they'll be able to communicate or market the concept into the customer's brain. So sometimes we have these, and there's not much you can do, and you just, you have to live with it, or maybe you'll get some of the things through, maybe you won't, and then in some environments, but those sorts of environments they often don't even proceed with this step, because you have to have an acceptance of evidence to proceed with the step. Now, we've had situations in the past where a senior person would say, oh, I think it should be called this, in the and we'd say, okay, we'd kind of know from experience that's not going to work. But we'd put it in, and then we'd come back the next round and say, well, when we called it this, it only had a 23% success rate, whereas when we called it this other thing, it had a 77% success rate in the process. So if we can get this evidential based, and, oh, that's a hypothesis, let's test it. And we say, oh, it didn't work, and then most of the time, people will, accept the evidence once they feel that there's a clear evidential path. One of the key things for this success is that you engage as many stakeholders as possible. If you do all of this with your little UX team or whatever, and then you finally present the results, it's just going to be a bombardment. People are going to say, what's this? And even though you have the evidence, you won't have the buy-in. So where we've found much more success is where we bring the organization along each step of the process. They were involved in identifying the top tasks that would go into the vote. As soon as the sort was done, they were involved in selecting the tasks that would go into the sort. It was explained to them the importance of selecting those tasks. That may take a little bit longer time to actually do, but I guarantee you get far better acceptance of the results later. So much projects today, we do them quickly and then they end up hitting a brick wall or never getting accepted because we didn't bring the organization with us. We need to bring the organization with us at every step of the evidential process so that we're building up a kind of a culture of acceptance of evidence and the process that was carried out.
All right. L Painter has a question about search. He wants to know, how did the changes you implement affect your search engine position results?
Yeah, that's an sometimes good, sometimes not so good. There's an interesting challenge that a lot of environments have, that often the words that people search with are not the words that they resonate with when they arrive at the actual site in the process. So people may search for cheap flights or cheap hotels, but they don't want to see the word cheap hotel when they get to the actual site in the process. Sometimes you get direct overlap. So the word that resonates in the architecture also is the word that's actually searched for in the process. But sometimes you've got actual certain challenges and you need a slightly different strategy for the search words versus what I call these care words in the process. But generally speaking, if you simplify and structure and make stuff and get stuff linked to, your search rankings will significantly go up, because Google likes a well-structured, well-organized site, and those sorts of sites tend to attract more links, tend to attract more usage and clicks on results, etc. So we find the better the structure, maybe not in the first couple of months. There's often a lag as you simplify and clean up your structure. But over time, we find that as you improve the information architecture, you improve the search findability as well.
Okay, Gerry, looks like we have time for just one more question. And that question is from Joy. And she'd like to know, do you have any advice on how to recruit testers? Apparently her partition rate has been very low.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's an increasing challenge. It's much harder today than it was last year. Much harder today than it was 5 years ago to get people in the process. So, prizes always work. If you don't have an engaged audience, you need to, incentivize them in some way. And what we find as well is that giving feedback, building up a community over time, that you actually give feedback back to people about the feedback they give you or the participation or what happened. Because a lot of people feel today that it's not worth participating in these studies because nothing will ever happen. They'll never see any results, and they're just wasting their time and their process. I mean, the best place is still from the website or the app itself. That's the people who are using the thing, the people who are visiting the thing are invariably the best. And I know it's horrible, but it still works. The pop-up still, is the best mechanism we find to actually get, the perfect type of audience. You might have, if you're in an intranet, it'll be a lot easier. If you're in, like when we were the European Commission, we had 100,000 people voted in the initial study, and 45,000 of them, said they'd like to participate in ongoing measurement. So people are cynical about the European Commission and say nobody loves the European Commission, nobody's engaged, nobody cares. Well, actually, there's a core audience out there that was extremely engaged on an ongoing basis. So it depends on the engagement you have, but off the website is still, or off the app is still the place where you're most likely to get more people, but more importantly, better people, the right type of people that you're trying to get at. I'd avoid panels if possible. You may not be able to avoid them totally because you tend to get less quality results coming through. But incentives, give prizes, definitely helps in the uptake.
All right, that's it. Thanks, everyone. This webinar has been recorded, and a link to the on-demand video will be emailed to you in a few business days. I'd like to especially thank Gerry McGovern and J. Robert Slaughter for speaking, and I'd also like to thank dotCMS for sponsoring today's event. And if your company is interested in sponsoring a webinar, please email us at webinars@cmswire.com. All right, have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.